Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Halloween Havoc 1998. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is for the WCW Television Championship. It is Raven versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was a good match to start Halloween Havoc 1998. Back and forth matchup between Raven and Jericho, with Raven keeping the pace of the match. Jericho then gets up, hits a springboard dropkick, sending Raven to the outside. Jericho then applies a lion tamer on Raven, but Raven quickly breaks the hold. Raven then hits a DDT on Jericho for a near fall, and then Jericho applies another lion tamer on Raven, and your winner of the match is Chris Jericho. Hats off to Chris Jericho for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Wrath versus Meng. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Wrath and Meng, with Wrath keeping the pace of the match. And Wrath ultimately hits the meltdown on Meng, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Wrath. Hats off to Wrath for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Juventud Guerrera versus Disco Inferno. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Guerrera and Inferno, with Guerrero keeping the pace of the match. But Disco Inferno ultimately hits a devastating pile driver on Guerrera in the middle of the ring, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Disco Inferno. Hats off to Disco Inferno for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Fit Finlay versus Alex Wright. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Fit Finlay and Alex Wright, with Finlay keeping the pace of the match. But Alex Wright hits a devastating neck breaker on Fit Finlay, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Alex Wright. Hats off to Alex Wright for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Lodi versus Saturn. I thought this was a glorified squash match. Saturn was keeping the pace throughout the entire match, with Saturn quickly hitting a Death Valley driver on Lodi, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Saturn. Hats off to Saturn for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Disco Inferno versus Billy Kidman. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Inferno and Kidman, with Kidman keeping the pace of the match. And Kidman ultimately hits his signature shooting star press off the top rope on Inferno, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is Billy Kidman. Hats off to Billy Kidman for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Rick Steiner teaming up with Buff Bagwell versus the Giant and Scott Steiner. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Giant and Scott Steiner keeping the pace of the match. Someone in the audience comes over the guardrail, attacks the WCW security. Come to find out, it was actually Buff Bagwell. Bagwell then tries to attack Rick Steiner. And then Rick ultimately gets up, lands a bulldog off the top rope on Scott Steiner, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Rick Steiner. Hats off to Rick Steiner for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Kevin Nash versus Scott Hall. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Nash and Hall, with Hall keeping the pace of the match. Nash and Hall both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Nash hitting 2 jackknife powerbombs on Scott Hall. Nash then leaves the ring, walks to the back. Referee then starts counting to 10, and your winner of the match by countout is Scott Hall. Hats off to Scott Hall for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship. It is Bret Hart versus Sting. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Hart and Sting, with Hart keeping the pace of the match. Hart then applies a sharpshooter on Sting, and your winner of the match by submission is Bret Hart. Hats off to Bret Hart for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Ultimate Warrior versus Hollywood Hogan. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between the Warrior and Hogan, with Hogan keeping the pace of the match. Eric Bischoff makes his way down to the ring. Eric then distracts the referee. Horace Hogan then attacks the Warrior with a chair shot. Hogan then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Hollywood Hogan. Hats off to Hollywood Hogan for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW's Halloween Havoc 1998. It is Goldberg defending the WCW World Heavyweight Championship against Diamond Dallas Page. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between DDP and Goldberg, with Goldberg keeping the pace of the match. And Goldberg ultimately hits his signature jackhammer on Diamond Dallas Page, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW World Heavyweight Champion, is Goldberg. Hats off to Goldberg for getting the win in this matchup. A couple of things I'm going to say about Halloween Havoc 1998 before I get out of here. Number one, it was a solid event. I was always a big fan of the Halloween Havoc pay-per-views. They're still technically being used today from NXT. But I was always a big fan of WCW having Halloween Havoc as a part of their pay-per-view schedule. I mean, I always liked the way it looked. Some of the matches they put on, for Halloween Havoc were fantastic. Number one match that comes to my mind is Eddie Guerrero versus Rey Mysterio, title versus mask. Absolutely fantastic matchup. With that being said, though, this card wasn't extremely that bad. There was a couple matches on here that were halfway decent. Raven versus Jericho for the television championship. It was a solid match. Wrath versus Ming. It was an okay match at best. I'll say that. And it's no disrespect towards Ming. Wrath, I mean, I don't know where his place was at the time with WCW when he came in. Obviously, later on, he, became a tag team. Later on in the years of WCW, towards the end of WCW, he was in a tag team. But I feel like right off the jump, I don't know where they really would have put Wrath, where he would have really fit in to WCW. Juventud Guerrero and Disco Inferno, solid matchup. Billy Kidman versus Inferno, again, was a solid match. I think Billy Kidman doesn't get a whole lot of credit. I mean, I think Kidman was one of the underrated cruiserweights that WCW had. Multi-time cruiserweight champion. And his finisher, the Shooting Star Press, man. I mean, not a lot of people saw that finisher until Kidman, pretty much did it off the top rope and hit the Shooting Star Press. And I think it shocked a lot of fans. I think it was one of those moves, even to this day, that's absolutely incredible. And hats off to Billy Kidman for getting the win over Disco Inferno in that matchup. Rick Steiner teaming up with Bagwell versus the Giant and Scott Steiner. It was a solid matchup, a little bit of confusion with Bagwell, but Rick Steiner ended up becoming victorious and becoming the new WCW Tag Team Champion. So hats off to Rick Steiner for that. Bret Hart versus Sting, solid matchup. I just wish it was a clean finish. Bret Hart ended up using a bat to attack Sting. Referee was knocked out in the match, and Bret ended up applying the sharpshooter on Sting and got the win. The other big match was Ultimate Warrior versus Hollywood Hogan, number one. Number one, I feel like, Ultimate Warrior, and I mean, obviously there's a lot of people out there that are Ultimate Warrior fans, and I'm not sitting here saying I'm not a Warrior fan either, but, I feel like with Ultimate Warrior, if he would have came in, or was given the opportunity from WCW to come in a little bit earlier in his career than what he did when he faced Hogan in 98, I think Ultimate Warrior, I don't know where you would have slotted Warrior. I mean, obviously, you could slot him in as being one of the top baby faces for WCW, but at the same time, they also had Sting. And Sting, was the company guy. Sting was every bit of WCW through and through. And when he took that sabbatical for that year off, and, obviously they wanted Sting to come back to take down the NWO from inside and out. Maybe it would have took away from Sting if they brought in a guy like Ultimate Warrior to go up against the NWO. I mean, I feel like that would have took away from Sting's comeback. But, if I'm being, a fantasy booker here, I think if Ultimate Warrior came in, I mean, there's definitely a couple matches on the card that Warrior would have had a really good match with. I think Warrior versus Lex Luger would have been a really good matchup for both Lex Luger and Ultimate Warrior. And I think Ultimate Warrior, if he would have came in, in the mid-90s, I think Ultimate Warrior really would have saved his in-ring career if WCW allowed him to come over in the early 90s to mid-90s rather than, the late 90s going into 2000. So it's a shame, man. It really is a shame. But in the main event, DDP versus Goldberg, it was a solid match, man. But what I will say about this match, is, from what I remember, is that I think when this match actually took place in 1998 on pay-per-view, the feed actually cut out for this main event. And I think the history of this match was that, when the feed cut out, they had to reimburse all these fans that had purchased this on pay-per-view. So you can imagine if, back in the day, back in 1998, you're spending, I don't know, $30, $40 for this pay-per-view or something like that, and then all of a sudden the main event, the one match you've been waiting for the entire night, the feed cuts out, and you don't get to know who what the finish was or who won until the following night on Nitro. And honestly, it really kind of set WCW back a little bit financially. I mean, obviously, reimbursing everybody that had purchased that pay-per-view, it was a bad look for WCW, man. And honestly, I mean, for what it's worth, I'm kind of glad in a small way that DDP didn't go over in that match, because you can only imagine if you're, a Diamond Dallas Page fan and he ends up somehow beating Goldberg for that World Heavyweight Championship, and the feed cuts out, and you don't even see him beat Goldberg for that championship. I think a lot of DDP fans will be, DDP fans will be distraught knowing that, oh man, he beat Goldberg and the feed cut out, and I couldn't see him, hit that diamond cutter on Goldberg. I think it would have really, made a lot of fans upset at that time when the feed cut out for that pay-per-view. But I always remember that about the Diamond Dallas Page and Goldberg match, man, with the feed cutting out, and WCW having to reimburse all these people the money back for the pay-per-view. It's absolutely insane times, man. But just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give WCW's Halloween Havoc 1998 a solid rating of a 5, 5.5 at best. But this is my review of Halloween Havoc 1998. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.